Let's get to talking about hardware for better blending. I just recently went to Blender's website and found that 279B is available for download. I switched from 279A to 279B, and there it was. Down after the thank you, after you start downloading Blender, with a simple click like that, you get to see the Coming Soon in Blender 2.8 Developers blog. This is something we get a lot of advice, especially when we have questions about hardware for better blending. What kind of hardware? There's a CPU, there's a GPU, there's RAM. These folks at the Blender Foundation work awfully hard to provide the correct answer right here on blender.org. Here I found a graph. It highlights benchmark results for different graphics cards for different scenes that are used to establish benchmarks. I was curious about these scenes but didn't know where to find them. Blender benchmark scenes. What a good search. A search for Blender benchmark scenes reveals the demo files that are used by the people developing Blender to test the benchmarks for NVIDIA and AMD cards. Here are some of the splash screens if you've had some favorites and want to go back and look at those. Here's the Fishy Cat, which is one of these fancy interactive graphs here. Fishy Cat renders awfully fast. The barbershop interior is from the Agent 327 series, and that apparently takes even really good render cards, graphics cards, an awfully long time to render. Higher is worse. You might be looking at the red and thinking, this is the way to go. And you may be looking at the little ones and thinking, oh, I don't want that. Let's drill down. We get a look at the render time for each of these color-coded bars which are tied into the graphics cards up above for benchmark results. Very clever stuff. So the one that was the fastest, the Quadro GP100, arranged by render time, is something we can copy and then do a search for. Going to the website and pasting in what you copied can reveal, oh, a $6,500 video card. Perhaps that's out of your budget. 4 minutes 12 seconds, and the longest render time seems to have been 17.5 minutes. Let's cut that difference. So let's look for 10 3/4 seconds and cut that difference right down the middle. Here's one. The GeForce GTX 980. Will it be $6,000? No. It'll be something a lot more reasonable, although still pretty inaccessible to a lot of people. If you're adulting and you have car payments, insurance payments, the mortgage, groceries, and anyone calling you mommy or daddy, you realize that almost $600 for a video card is still pretty darn steep. 4 gigabytes of RAM on a video card? Let's go back and talk about these things. The CPU. This is what Blender uses when all else fails. In the Render tab, the CPU is the device that you can use to compute what you need to get things rendered. And in doing that, with support for your CPU, just 10 samples, path tracing, a scene that I have here of a displaced mesh and a couple of materials, can take a pretty long time. Almost 14.5 seconds to render something that's not even fully post-processed. And just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about with my own system, I have a rather old, maybe 5-year-old Core i7. It's working at 3.5 gigahertz, but it's only a 3770. So the Core i7s and their generations is already up to the 8700. Well, that just destroys mine here, of course. Fallback render by what you can. 32 gigabytes of RAM is what I loaded up on for Windows 10 Pro here, because I knew that RAM was really good for simulations. So if Hair Systems and the Cloth Sim upgrade is worth it to you, take a look at purchasing a little extra RAM and get those numbers up. The GPU. The GPU is a graphics processor unit that can compute as a device the render time for something that you are looking at. Switching from CPU to GPU takes us from 14.2 seconds to 1.38 seconds in the exact same little preview image that we have here. Even expanding this with the home button through the camera view still barely puts it to 5 seconds, 4.5 seconds to render the exact same thing. And if we just go ahead and scrub right through the animation to the last frame, barely a bit of lag. The thing about the GPU with versions of Blender is that you can toggle over to the experimental feature set and get access to even more intriguing features using additional settings inside your material. This isn't covering materials, it's just covering the hardware for better blending. So the clock speed is a little harder to analyze by just looking at the numbers that are up on top of any listing. Let's just go to the first GTX 980 that comes up. A core clock of 1127, 1.1 gigahertz. You can boost it to 1.2. Just out of curiosity, what was the core clock for the Quadro GP100? NVIDIA's own white paper on the graphics processing unit, the GP100, which is the processing unit on board the Tesla P100, oh my gosh, has a base clock of 1.3 gigahertz, and it can be boosted to 1.4. Now that's very interesting, because 1.3 and 1.4 don't seem like numbers that are far away from 1.1 and 1.2. What could be the biggest element of a graphics card with which to concern yourself? Perhaps it's the kind of RAM, the short-term memory, that's built on to that graphics card. This has 4 gigabytes of 256-bit GDDR5. Whew. This has 4 gigabytes for just the cache alone, which is something. Look at these numbers. I mean, some of these I haven't even heard before. So GDDR5, here's HBM2. In scanning this article very quickly, I do see that the structure for Vega 56 positions it competitively with the GTX 1070, according to gamersnexus.net. So the Vega 56 is right here, and where the 980 rendered the scene in 10 3/4 seconds, the Vega 56 did it in 8 minutes. It might be time to begin putting Vega into your vernacular when considering video cards. Why don't we just take a quick look at the Vega 56? About $600 for 10 3/4 minutes. Over $600 for 8 minutes. On the same scene, Pavilion Barcelona. It's always good to go right to the source, and one of the reasons I recommend coming right to the source is because Blender makes sure that everything you need to know is available on their website. It's not always something that you may find outrageously easy to find, but the information is here. As a matter of fact, it took me a while to find this requirements. The requirements that are base level requirements according to blender.org. Optimal production grade hardware. A 64-bit 8-core CPU. Information about your cores can be found under the Render tab under the heading Performance. You allow Blender to auto-detect and it will find how many cores your processor has. 16 gigabytes of RAM. Got that. I'm only using one HD display, and I have no idea how many bits of color it can handle. I am using a 3-button mouse, and if you're using a graphics tablet, there is a way in Blender, under User Preferences, to emulate the number pad and the 3-button mouse. Dual OpenGL 3.2 with 4 gigabytes of RAM. As you can see, I'm using one old GTX 690 with what claims to be 18,000 megabytes of graphics memory. Shared system memory is a setting inside of Windows. It doesn't actually count towards rendering a scene. When you render a scene, you're using the RAM on board your video card, and there are cases where you can simply run out of memory. A lot of hair, a lot of particles, a lot of objects, a lot of polygons. Adding some post effects like that mist in the background also is very taxing to your video card. So when Blender suggests 4 gigabytes of RAM, and you have a video card with only 2 gigabytes on board, you're actually coming in at a quarter of Blender's recommended hardware for production grade animation work. That's why I wanted to recommend that you go to the source and take a look at what's inside your budget, and using the Blender website to check the benchmark results, examine your budget, and remember, the Vega 56 is using something called high bandwidth memory. It's something that can stack, unlike the older tried and true GDDR5 memory. Up and coming. Down and going. So I've done an unfair price comparison. I should be looking at a GTX 1070. You can spend an hour. I just wanted to spend a few minutes getting you a basic idea of where to go to get information. It looks as though you can still come in under $600 compared to the Vega 56. 1070, I don't see it. The Vega 56 renders faster than the GTX 1080. Of course, then there are little additions like the GTX 1080 Ti, which howls way faster than 8 minutes at just over 6 minutes. You compare the cost of 1080 versus a GTX 1080 Ti at $900 versus that $600 price point. Okay, that's about all the information that I can handle given right now. This has 8 gigabytes of memory, which is really fantastic for less than $700. This has 11 gigabytes. If you had 2 of these, you really wouldn't be waiting around for renders in cycles. But doesn't beat the 1080 Ti. Now you know the budget you'll be putting aside. This is information we should all be accessing for better blending. So blend on and take care.